Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you to coming to this special Parks event. We've shared hashtag uploading Holocaust, which I presume that's how you pronounce it. I don't actually know if there's a kind of hashtag uploading _Holocaust. I don't. It's a curious world, Udi. I mean, you can tell us.
Uploading Holocaust is fine. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Claire or Yuri, would you be able to play the trailer for us? So we're going to begin there, and then I'll introduce our speakers, and then we'll have 10 minutes of reflections from Jackie, then Megan, then Udi, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion, and then we'll end with questions and answers from the audience and participants. So thank you very much.
Is it working?
Yeah.
אני נוסע בשביל לראות.
מה לראות?
הכל.
ברצינות.
הכל, באמת. למה מי שלא רואה את זה לא יכול להבין מה קרה שם.
מה זה זה? מה זה זה?
השואה?
כמו שאתם רואים, הגענו למחנה מיידנק. הבנתי שזה המחנה הכי קשה היום. מעניין אם הם יישארו מחייכים בשלוש שעות הקרובות.
מעבירים את הילדים אל משאיות לעבר תחנת הרכבת הזאת כאן, תחנת רכבת האימא.
ויש פה כלבים, ויש פה זרקורים. והריח של השריפה של הבשר הזה, איך מעבירים ריח?
זה היה קשה, אבל זה לא היום של הבכי. מחר בטח יהיה יותר קשה.
נכנסים לתאי גזים, תאי גזים.
אם היו מרצים, נרצים את העיניים שלהם בקירות.
אימא'לה.
מה שעצוב לי שאני לא חי את זה. אני מרגיש שדפוק.
זה לא בדיחה מה שקורה. אוקיי, ואני רוצה שתתחילו להרגיש.
הולכים איפה שהיו בורות הירי. ובוא נראה מה קורה.
לילה! הם נכנסים את הבור! לילה!
אני לא רוצה להרגיש במקום כל כך.
לצערנו, גם היום עלינו להילחם ולהגן על מדינתנו מפני צוררינו שרוצים להשמידנו.
Thank you, Claire. Brilliant. Okay, so to open the event, I'd like to invite Jackie to speak first, to give us his thoughts on the film. Jackie Feldman is Professor in Sociology and Anthropology at Ben-Gurion University, author of Above the Death Pits Beneath the Flag, Youth Voyages to Poland and the Performance of Israeli National Identity. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's been a privilege to be invited to this discussion. I started researching the trips in Poland in 1992. And I thought when I began to research this for my doctoral work that what I was going to see was the birth of a mourning rite for the destruction of European Jewry that might be a kind of canonical form of mourning that might endure for the next for future centuries. It came out of a personal search and a personal voyage of mine to the place where my father was born, where my grandmother was buried before the Shoah. And I thought that, when I saw small knots of parents and children traveling to very out of the way places in Eastern Europe, I thought that they must be doing the same kind of personal roots and mourning research that I was. And at this point, the trips to Poland, which began in 1984, were still in their infancy. There were only maybe 200-300 people traveling a year. When I started to study it by 2019, I don't know the exact figures. I would guess it's about 25,000 or so. And so I joined the guide course for Poland guides. I took 5 groups to Poland and guided them. I went with another one in order to be a participant observer and not guide, and then went several years later on a 7th trip with an Orthodox group to see perhaps what the variants were and what I might have missed. And I quickly found that I was asking the wrong question, and that it really was not so much a rite of mourning. Most of the students and most of the guides really could care less about the life of Jews in Poland before the war. Some were very clearly bored by it, with the exception of some of the national religious groups. And what it was really about was casting Poland as a death land, a death world, as the alternative to Israel. So it was kind of a pilgrimage to a center out there, but not an ascent to the holy place, but rather a descent to the death pits, so that one would come out and then reaffirm one's belonging to Israel as the only possible center of life. So the title I later gave the book was called Above the Death Pits Beneath the Flag. And the idea being that the students, through their embodiment, in particular here a reference to the ceremonies, one of the key ceremonies that takes place above the ruins of the crematoria at Birkenau and underneath the raised Israeli flags, were a way of getting students who had been born long after the Shoah to identify with the Shoah and its Israeli narrative, to be bodily the link between the ashes below them and the Israeli flag above them, and thus to see themselves as embodiment both of the Shoah and of the state as response to the Shoah. So a kind of redemptive narrative in which Israel, the state of Israel, and for some, at least, the future service in the army, serves as a kind of answer to the Shoah. In looking at these, much of this, of what I found that, very much of what I have to say is really conveyed through the film. There are some other elements that can't be conveyed through YouTube trips because they require further zoom out in terms of what the history of the Shoah is in Israeli society, what the role of the Ministry of Education is, and how the trips are ritually constructed, their time frames, the role of security in creating environmental bubbles that keep the Israeliness inside the bus, inside the hotel, whereas what's outside becomes the death world of Poland, and then to create this dichotomy of life and death, and to regulate carefully the time and the security considerations and the way this works. This to me was a very important part of the rhythm of the trip. But what the film does do, and I think does very well, is to convey a lot of the emotional tenor of the trips, and very often how that emotion is manipulated. I could identify very well because the images span 27 years. Some of them are as early as 1987. The last of them listed is 2014. And in the early ones, I know some of the guides. I was in Poland with some of the guides and some of the survivor witnesses who were there. So even some that may seem to be, wow, do they really do that? Isn't that over the top? I said, yeah, Itzik did that. That's how he guided, So in this sense, the idea of creating a composite of 27 years of trips is there are some changes, but I think in my talking to people afterwards, I was often surprised at how little the trips have changed over the years. So I think that's fair to create that composite image. Again, the emotional tenor has perhaps as much to do with hormones as with Holocaust. These are 15 and 16-year-olds, crying together, getting emotional, getting hugged by the queen or, head of the class. This is all, part of the dynamic. However, it has a role too, because as you've seen in the film, the guide, and it's saying, start feeling already. And I can attest to having seen this of people who go into the gas chambers along with tape recordings and put on the sad music and think it's a great success if they can all kind of collapse and shed tears. And it's important for these students as well, because if they break out or break down in tears, then it's to them a kind of self-affirmation of the authenticity of their feelings and their experience. And then they can say things like, I cried finally when I got there. Now I understand. Well, I don't know what exactly one understands because the tears come out of one's eyes, but for 16-year-olds, I can understand perfectly well how it works. And very often the guides take their own success as their ability to evoke these tears. And just perhaps a word or two, and I'll stop. Again, these trips have continued, and I think it's to the and the trips also serve many educators and the Ministry of Education as a way of promoting a more security-oriented Israeli national identity. To what extent they work is over the long run is a difficult question to answer through research. These are one-time trips. How do you measure what it does over the course of a long-term period? But apparently, they're a success, and until Corona, the numbers continued to expand. Perhaps we'll hear from Udi, but one of the things is if we look at when they're put up to YouTube, that means that for some of these photos, it may have taken as much as 20 years from the time that they were first taken until they could be uploaded onto a site, which means for those people who are now adults of 35 or 40 years old, they at least identified enough with what they had said 20 years previously in order to agree to put them up on the site, and then to agree, perhaps as much as 10 years later, with Udi to have these things broadcast as part of the film. So it's not like something, you do when you're 15 years old, and then, you say, I'm embarrassed to do it. On the contrary, somewhere that people who had these uploaded 20 years and shown 30 years later, perhaps, identify with these things enough today in order to take pride in having this broadcast on the website and in a film. So that means that something about these texts has continued and continues to be true. If there are two things, last word, that I think changed significantly, they are one, that in the early periods, you have all of the, or almost all of the, if not groups, then delegations accompanied by a survivor witness. And the survivor witness plays a key role in creating that identification with the dead, or with the victims, I should say, very often through a bodily co-presence. Okay. Whereas in the later trips, already starting 2005, 2010, there are very few today witnesses who are alive and in physical condition to undertake what is for them a difficult trip, right, physically as well as emotionally. So there have to be replacements later for the witnesses, of which films are one, or of which simulations may be another. And the second thing is that you have the selfies and a YouTube presence now that's far more integrated into the time of the trip, or then changes the time of the trip. Because instead of standing and, bowing one's head and walking in together, everyone's standing with their backs to the site, getting their selfies, taking their selfies and uploading it instantly and waiting for the likes to come. So that means that something about the social solidarity that's created in the trip, one may have to work much harder to create it when one is in touch with one's friends online more than the people who are standing next to them. But all said, I think it gives a very accurate picture of the trip, particularly from the point of view of its participants and guides. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie. Excellent start. I like the disjointed connectedness which comes across very clearly in that. So thank you. Next, Megan. So just quickly. Megan Lundgren, and apologies for pronunciation, has a PhD in history and collaborated on social media in the digital mediascape, which has a focus on dark tourism, YouTube, and memory. Megan.
Yes, Lundgren, proper pronunciation. So you got it good. So I wanted to thank our organizers for inviting me to participate in what I'm sure is going to be a very invigorating discussion. My research mostly focuses on the ways in which social media platforms can shape or shift or even confront contemporary Holocaust memory. And so watching this documentary was fascinating to me. My master's research was on YouTube. In my PhD, I gravitated more toward Instagram, and there were a lot of things that I could really pick apart and delve into here. And I know that when it comes to social media, there is this prevalent anxiety about whether or not the sharing of such difficult and horrendous histories on social media platforms like YouTube or Instagram or Facebook could be considered to be appropriate or the proper form of behavior remembrance. But I think that uploading Holocaust definitely showcases the complications that come with these platforms. As we know, at the beginning of uploading Holocaust, we know that there are 30,000 clips on YouTube connected in some way to the journey to Poland that Israeli high school students undertake every year. And similarly, this isn't the only instance of a memory boom on social media when it comes to Holocaust memory. For example, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum has 121,000 followers on Instagram. They have over 300,000 followers on YouTube. And most major Holocaust museums and memorial sites have developed social media strategies and programming for their institutions. So this anxiety around sharing the Holocaust in the social media scape seems to be less about whether or not there is a social media presence and more about the ways in which people are making use of these platforms to showcase their experiences with Holocaust memory. So I wanted to touch on a couple of prominent themes that I found while watching that I felt were important to uploading Holocaust, especially as they relate to broader themes in social media memory and the Holocaust today. And the one theme that stands out most pronounced to me is this gray area between a sense of performance and authenticity. And everybody, so those of you whose cameras that I can see, who's taken a selfie before? Like I have. I'm a millennial, so I've taken a selfie. So if you've taken a selfie or you've turned a video camera on yourself, you know that there's going to be some performative element to that action. So, you're going to pose a certain way, you're going to look a certain way, you're going to act a certain way. And this performance is something that is low-key, ever-present in social media. And it encourages this form of self-regulation in some ways and outward expression that, though intertwined with authenticity and earnestness, is always going to be part of this larger performance of identity in an online world. So it's about how you want yourself to be seen in conjunction with the rest of your online identity. And this aspect of the social media performance is more pronounced with generations that have grown up with social media, for example. They're more used to this idea of exhibiting themselves online. And when I say performance, I don't necessarily mean that these videos that these students have filmed, that they lack earnestness. It's more so that whomever is creating this content is constructing it with a specific identity in mind. And it might not even always be conscious. So it's they film these videos with an idea that it's going to go online, that their parents are going to see them, that their friends are going to see them. It's about kind of upholding this sense of identity for the camera and for a potential audience. And one of the most striking aspects of the film, as it related to this gray area between performance and authenticity, is found when students are speaking directly to the camera one-on-one. And we can discuss, I'm sure we're going to discuss this a lot more later. Jackie has already brought it up. In these one-on-one sessions, one can sense a very real anxiety or trepidation on the part of the student about what they are feeling, what they are supposed to be feeling, what they are expected to be feeling, and how they are telegraphing that to their audience through their videos. And this is a recurring theme, and it's particularly prominent in the more contemporary documentary, or the contemporary footage. As Jackie mentioned, some of the older footage from the 80s and 90s tended to focus more on the trip itself, the experiences of survivor witnesses, sites that were visited. And I got the sense that from the older footage, it's more of the camera acts as more of a silent view into these tours. It's less about the feelings of that particular person behind the camera. But when we get to, 2000s, the advent of YouTube, the personal and the outward become a little bit more intertwined, a little bit more messy and complicated, as it were. And it is interesting how many of the more recent students on these tours expressed this anxiety about not feeling like they weren't feeling sad enough, or they weren't sure how they were supposed to be feeling, or they were feeling pressures from outside forces to engage in a certain way. So, for example, one of the really poignant lines in this documentary was the clip of the young man who overheard his classmate's vlog in the hallway in the hotel. She's sitting in and reflecting on her day, and he commiserated with her, saying, "The only thing about Poland that makes me sad is that I can't feel anything." And it's I found it to be a very self-aware assessment of their experience on that trip. I know it's easy to sometimes, dismiss social media as being frivolous or not necessarily the deepest form of engagement, but I felt that there was a very kind of real sense of engagement and self-awareness and consideration about how they're supposed to be kind of maneuvering all of these experiences that they're having on this trip. So it all kind of relates back to this idea of how social media has shifted these trips, how it's changed how we perceive the memory of the Holocaust. And, in this day and age, teens, young adults, even adults, if we're being honest, we spend so much of our lives online that I think the use of these social media platforms, even if it's, 20, 10, 5 years removed from the trip itself, it remains a very familiar tool for many people to showcase and grapple with some of these complex concepts that these teens are currently kind of engaging with. And it's intriguing to me that even something that has become as mundane and everyday as a YouTube video or a selfie or a photo on Instagram can be an important form of media for the transmission of Holocaust memory in the digital age. Because the thing about YouTube is that these videos are out there. They're not just going to be consumed necessarily by a specific group of people, and there's tens of thousands of them. It's an important and accessible digital archive that anybody can access, and that you can sort through and reflect on the experiences of these students as they journey through Poland. So to conclude, I kind of wanted to point out that while uploading Holocaust draws its source material from YouTube clips that cover decades of these journeys to Poland, YouTube did not necessarily create or foster the impetus for capturing these experiences on video. YouTube is a newer platform that allows for the transmission of this information. And as is the case with most forms of travel, even outside of dark tourism, people rely on recording devices and photographs to help them remember and cement their experiences more accurately. I know that we all have memories that we think we experienced even from our young childhood that might be memories that we just have from looking at a photo. We know it happens because the photo is proof of that. And in the past, a lot of these sources like photographs or video were preserved through family photo albums and were shared with closer social and familial circles. Now, YouTube provides an opportunity for that audience to grow. So I would like to propose in this instance that YouTube, in many ways, is a tool for remediation. It can be a tool for reflection. I know we've all looked back on things that we've done when we were younger and a lot of like seen kind of how we've grown as adults. And I think that YouTube allows for the growth of a crowdsourced digital archive of very personal individual experiences that contribute to a broader collective. And while students might not have all these answers when they're, talking to their phones, they might not be able to accurately label what they're feeling. The presence of their experience in a larger digital YouTube archive that contains over 30,000 clips, for example, cements those complicated feelings within the legitimacy of a lived and shared experience.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, no problem.
So we've gone from the connecting this to the collective, which is interesting, and the performance of identity, which is also really fascinating, given that I've got a screen, just faces and such intensity of the faces in a way that I wouldn't have in a room necessarily, which is kind of fascinating and scary at the same time. So thank you for that. So finally, is by way of our third speaker, is Udi Nur, and again, apologies for pronunciation, writer, director, and producer. His first feature documentary was Uploading Holocaust, followed by Golder in 2019. Studied at the School of Playwriting in Tel Aviv, created theatre shows, and worked as a producer at Children's Theatre. Before turning to art, he worked for Amnesty International and other human rights NGOs. Udi, over to you.
Hello. Thank you very much for having this fascinating discussion. I think I'll probably start by telling you a little bit about how this thing came to be, because about almost 10 years ago now, me and my partner, Sagi Bornstein, we were talking about, we wanted to make a documentary and we were talking about things that might be interesting. And I remembered I started telling him about my own personal journey to Poland when I was 16 and the experience that I remembered, which in essence, I think had to do with this feeling that you have to feel something more than anything else. This kind of frustration of not feeling, this kind of ambiguous, undefined, it's not exactly sadness, it's not exactly horror, it's not, nobody knows what exactly is it. We know it's expressed with tears, or it could be expressed with tears, and we all knew, and I definitely personally knew, that I have to feel it in those 7 days. And feelings anyway when you're 17 are, a big thing, and it had to be bigger than life when it happened. And I remember walking down Majdanek. I think Majdanek was the last day of our tour, and I still haven't cried up to that point, which was devastating. And I wouldn't let it go. I remember myself standing inside Majdanek, wrapped in a flag, 2 flags actually, the Israeli flag and a pride flag, because I said, if I'm not going to cry because Jews were killed, maybe I'll cry because gays were killed. I mean, I'll recruit everything that I can. And I stood there amidst the shoe rack, I think it was the shoe racks in one of the huts in Majdanek. And I wouldn't let it go for 20 minutes when everybody already had to go. And I wouldn't let it go until I finally shed some tears. Then I went back to the bus. And I was able to go back home. And I remember thinking how absurd, on the bus already, I remember thinking how absurd that situation was. And what is it that brought me to behave like that, and so on. And there were other stuff that I remembered as being weird in this trip. And then a couple of years ago, when we wanted to make a documentary, I said, let's look at this. Let's look at this journey. There's an interesting sort of microcosmos of, for me, troubling processes that Israeli society is going through. in this journey. Certain kinds of indoctrination and nationalism and certain things that we see in our daily lives here for a long while now, we thought were really well represented in a way in these trips. And it started out as a normal documentary. So we teamed up with a bunch of schools across Israel and started to film their preparation process for the journey. And we almost accidentally we had to find some materials to raise some funds for the film. And we looked up one night at home the journey to Poland on YouTube. And back then it was 10,000 results. By the time we finished the film in 2016, it was 30,000. But anyways, that night was incredible. We kept watching all the way through the morning, getting exposed to more and more incredible documentation moments from these trips, and slowly realizing that students, which is not something that I knew from my own trip, that students, especially in the last couple of years, are heavily encouraged to document and share online their trips, which is not something that often happens in school, not so extensively. And so we slowly started a process of changing the whole film in light of that discovery, all the way to eventually understanding that the whole film will be composed of these materials. And I think there's a bunch of stuff that I think I want to touch on, but I think two things were most fascinating for us with this link between YouTube and these journeys. One was that when we started this film in general, we knew that we wanted to get some different voices. You know, we knew what the official state narrative is, and we knew that we probably want to sort of divert from that narrative from time to time, or find an alternative voice. And our assumption when we started to work with YouTube materials was that inside these 10,000 self-documented, self-shared videos, there must be more diversity than there could ever be if we follow, 3 or 4 or 5 schools across Israel. Even if we try to pinpoint the more alternative schools or whatever. And that was, I have to say, one of the biggest disappointments of going through these materials, because the harder we went into it, the more we tried to find a narrative that diverts from the official state narrative of the Holocaust, the less we found it. We went deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole of the same usual structure of how you tell the story of the Holocaust, what conclusions do you draw, and most importantly, what questions do you ask when you deal with this topic. There were a few exceptions. The ones that we could cling on to sort of made it into the film. What Megan said, and I agree, one of the moments that were also for us more revealing or more reflective, at least, were these students who sometimes mentioned how they felt about how they were meant to feel in a way, or any kind of addressing by them of the situation, and not just the story that they're being taught and then duplicate, was for us fascinating. But there was so few of that. There was so little of that. It was something we sort of grappled with for a long part of editing this film. And then the second thing, which was for us fascinating, at least in terms of documentation and also in terms of the Holocaust remembrance, I guess, but was when we, at a certain point, we started realizing that, as you also mentioned, footage is being retroactively uploaded to YouTube. So we could find videos that originate way before YouTube did. And so we started to look basically on almost all the span of these journeys from the late 80s to the point where the film was made. And one of the most fascinating things that changed over time, and you could really see it sort of slowly changing in several marks, was the turning of the camera, basically. When people went to these trips, and I think it's true for other areas of life, it's not just the Holocaust or just these kind of remembrance trips, it's many other things, but people used to hold the camera, to point the camera at the object or at the topic that they were trying to document. And slowly, especially from 2006, 7, 8 onward, that's when YouTube started, but also when vlogging became a thing, the camera just turns. It's no longer what I'm documenting, it's how I'm positioned or what I'm feeling inside what I'm documenting. And that changed for us the whole story, because it's a huge shift in what kind of material is created and what the discussion is about, in a way. So I think for us with YouTube, that was these were the two most interesting points. And then I wanted to relate to some things I heard before. It was interesting to hear, Jackie, your experience from studying and for also being in these journeys from early on, because, and you said that they didn't change much, which I found interesting, because we felt that there was one huge difference in how we saw it, but we were not there in the 80s. So I'm actually interested in hearing more from you on that, because we felt that in the late 80s, early 90s, from what we could read and also from what we could see in the material, the people who were leading it, or the way that this thing even came about, was basically Holocaust survivors who were also educators, who took their students and went with them to these places, which some of them have experienced personally, the same exact places, and sort of guided them through the story. That's how it's at least told in Israel, the beginning of the journeys. I see that you have a more nuanced version of that, so I'll be happy to hear that. But anyways, there still is a very strong, and I think you could feel it in the materials from the 80s, there is a very strong personal element to the situation. The journeys are not so big, it's not so many people, each delegation is quite small. One delegation will most likely, or in all events, will not meet another delegation at the same place. And then later on, even in the film, you could see, these shots where you have one delegation of 200 people leaving one hat and another group of 200 people entering it right at the same time. So it really became sort of industrialized over the years because of how much it grew in size, which I think is a huge difference. I have a personal fascination with the Holocaust for many years. My father took me to visit a concentration camp for the first time when I was 9 years old. It was a fascinating moment in my life that opened my eyes to a whole bunch of things and changed my worldview in the long run in many ways, I believe. But it was personal and private. It was me and my father and the story of our family. It wasn't, or it was very different when I went again when I was 17 with my school, which was then over 400 people in a delegation. Meeting or constantly coming in contact with other huge groups of hundreds of people at the same locations. I think that is basically the biggest flaw of this weird educational enterprise that grew up, that expanded without control over the years. I think there's a huge difference between visiting these places on a personal basis and inside such an industrialized mechanism. And I think that whenever something is industrialized to that scale, the really weird distortions basically will start. That's when it becomes hard to deal with difficult questions, with complexity, with nuance, with layers. That's when everything becomes, a stanz. It's all the same. They all go through the exact same, all supposed to feel the exact same thing. We couldn't see anyone in the journeys in the 80s and early 90s who was even remotely talking or mentioning, not from the guides, not from the students, anything about having to feel something. If you felt it, you felt it. Most of them did. Most of them, you could see most of them quite emotional, but there was nobody pressed it. Nobody brought, a microphone, a speaker, and try to play music for them or light candles for them, or the theatrical aspect of it was not there. It was just what it was. Again, maybe you've experienced something different in the 80s and 90s. I'm interested to hear about that, but as far as we could see from the material, there was a huge, huge difference. I think I can touch on a bunch of other things, but I can, I'm not a researcher, so I don't structure my talking as well as you guys do, but I'm happy to answer any questions or take part in the discussion.
Thanks, Udi. There'll be no structure from me, I can assure you. So thank you. Brilliant. I mean, I'll go to Jackie to respond in the first instance because of just what you've said, but I think just to pick up on a couple of things, the feeling thing is something that Oren's mentioned in the chat as well, and it's clearly very important. And what I'm reminded of, and this is obviously now 25-ish years ago, is that when the Bill Komersky fragment fraud story broke, the Daniel Gansfried, the journalist who exposed Bill Komersky, said the thing that proved it for him that he was not a real survivor was that he went to Auschwitz and Majdanek and he cried when he was there. And he said in the interview, that's just bullshit. Survivors don't do that. And it's really interesting how that feeling thing is more to the fore now. And so it'd be interesting to know what it was like. So Jackie, to come to you now, and also why people think we're there.
Well, first of all, thank you to all of you. I found, first of all, I found this, right now I'm researching transmission of Holocaust in a digital generation. So this question of selfies, concerns me a great deal. I think that the placing of oneself in center, front and center gets a legitimacy that is, a lot more legitimacy. That's what you have to show, right? If you have the wrong smile and you take a selfie, well, that can get you a lot of flack. But if you're tearful enough, people will excuse you, right? Princess Brianna, this who posted her selfie, this was part of her story. If she could claim in some way to be mourning, then all right, the pressure eased up a bit, even if she was perfectly posed in her pink costume with all the lines perfectly drawn, all lines centered and so on. But the feeling has always been, I think, again, my experience starts in when I first went 1991, 92, there was a lot of talk about feelings because this was the way for I think, for students in order to say that they understood that it was a measure of authenticity. If you could be overpowered by feelings so that the tears would come out of, exit they would use these words, in spite of your will to hold back, so to speak, then that means that it really got to you. And already in the 90s, there were guides saying, and organizers saying, the coin always drops at the second or the third sight, so that, right, the idea of the person actually crying was like hearing the coin dropping in the old machines, right? That okay, you were going to get your product, right? Your Coca-Cola would come out the bottom, right? Because the coin dropped. And then they said, good. And there were some who actually went in at the time with the boom boxes they took into the dissection table right before the crematorium of Majdanek, and said, well, I go in and then I play this sad song. It's called The Tears of Angels, T'maot Shel Malachim at the time. And then within 5 minutes, I've got them all on the floor crying. And this was a kind of, he's very proud of himself in that, he was able to get everybody to shed tears. And then, and for some of the students too, they very same frustrations. I remember hearing already in the 90s of, well, I didn't cry, what's wrong with me? Again, it wasn't these, I think there is a difference with turning the camera on yourself, but one of the most important sources that I had is that, there were a handful, about 6 of the main group or others who kept diaries and who would write, constantly. And then at the end of the trip, I asked, can I copy these? I'll give them back to you. And then they said, just erase whatever you don't want me to know. And very few did. And that was, so it could give me these sources. And the question of crying, where I cried or not, was important already back then. I think now it gets even more importance, where you have to, have the right facial expression, and that that's going to be what's posted, what's logged, what's up there for the future, or for the world, that you need to talk to all the time. I think one of the things that, if you mentioned, or was it of turning your back, right, Megan, of turning the camera back to the other way around, also means that, as I said, you turn your back to the site and you place yourself at the center. So that I think that amplifies a tendency that was already there, because already back then, this was a mass phenomenon. Okay, there weren't far fewer who went, but it kept picking up as the time went on. And there are plenty of people who went already in the 90s because their good friend went, the girl who they wanted to get close to was going, their brother or sister went. And so, everyone in the school went. So it was, there's peer pressure in order to go, and peer pressure in order to show that you understood it by crying. That's the easy way to get, you got the message right. So that was already, in that sense, back then. And even though, as you say, there weren't that many delegations meeting up, from the beginning, at least in the Ministry of Education, these groups were organized into large delegations, numbering from anywhere from 120 up to several hundreds. So the fact that there aren't thousands doesn't matter so much. There was congestion, and there were even, hey, on the walkie-talkies at the time, hey, let's go. We want to get into the gas chambers too. These kind of almost, bizarre, right, conversations. Let's go. One thing that happened about this question of personality and the guides at the very beginning. Okay, very beginning. I mean, 1984 through 87, 88. They would have survivors guide groups. And the survivors would guide, and then they would take on local Polish guides to navigate and to do other sites that they didn't know. And by the time I got into the course in 91, they saw that this was problematic, because then the survivor would say, and when I was in Auschwitz, and when we were in Majdanek, and we were in Warsaw, and he said, wait a minute, how did he get to the Warsaw Ghetto and Majdanek and Auschwitz? How did the survivor get around everywhere? So in order to create to increase the authenticity of the survivor, they instructed him only talk about places where you actually were. Let the guide, who were their teachers, many of them second generation, there are interesting stories about this too, they will give all the background, they will give all the history, they will give all the information, right? So you have this division of embodiment on the one hand and information on the other, a rough division. And then instructions to say, never contradict the witness, even if he's wrong, because you have to, he's like, I call it the shaman, you have to, or the priest, you have to enforce his authority, right? And so if he got it wrong, never mind, right? That's his story. And then, and if he interrupts you, well, you can make it up later at night, just let him talk, or her, right? And very often, for fascinating thing I found, and I'll shut up here, was that I did one group where I met a group of students who had gone 5 years previous and who had not met each other, many of them, for 3 or 4 years after. And I brought them together and I said, well, what do you remember about the trip? And they said, well, we remember, and we were in Auschwitz and Birkenau. And said, well, what do you remember? I said, well, we were in the, they brought us into the children's barracks and they sat us on the floor, and it was cold and it was rainy and it was really scary. And I said, well, did you have a witness with you? He said, yeah, Miriam. And I said, well, so what do you know about her? He said, well, she brought us into the children's barracks and she sat us on the floor, and it was cold and it was wet and it was really scary. And I said, well, what did Miriam say? and nobody could tell me, right? Which meant for me that what was really important, and I think really important still today when I look at holograms, when I look at interactive games, when I look at, the way testimony is then transmitted, it's the body of the witness that counts even more than their story. So the witness was there and he could point to the kids and say, you see that, right? I was there, right? And I wasn't wearing a warm coat and I didn't have, but that's what counts. That's what they talk about. That's what they remember. And this embodiment is very, very difficult to replace. And I think that's what a lot of people, whether it be through selfies or whether it be through interactive games or others, or whether it be through holograms, are somehow trying to find a substitute for the body of the witness that can make them see that we're there, even more than their story, because you can retell the story. But heck, if they told the story in the bus at 7 in the morning, everybody, all the kids would sleep through it. Wasn't embodied. Couldn't see it.
I wanted to say one thing fascinating, and I wanted to say one thing about that. I think that I remember that when we were working on the film, we were constantly grappling with this question of why are we going there? Why are people going there? What are we looking for in the place that we can't read in a book, see in a movie, hear from a witness back home? Most of them are here. They're not in Poland. Why are we going there? And it kept coming back to, I think there's also something very human about it. The scale of the event is enormous. The complexity of human interaction, strange, bizarre human interactions within it are unbearable to most of us. We can't picture it. We can't understand exactly how it worked, especially when we're 16, 17. And there is something, and also the reality of it, even in a way, the aesthetics of it are just, mind-boggling. And in trying to understand it, there is this sort of natural tendency to want to touch it. I think it has to do with the witness, for example, as an embodiment, and it also has to do with the place. I remember that I asked one of the guides, and we also saw it in some of the footage, people asking, was this tree here? Was this tree planted later or not? How is, you're trying, and then when the guide would say, yes, this tree was here, there was this, I remember going and touching it. There was an attempt to sort of grasp the event on a physical level that I think is very human. Is it the most effective, or does it lead to the right questions and conclusions and educational process? I have lots of doubts there, but I think it's very human.
I mean, I suppose I'm reminded of our friend at Parks, Avril Alba in Sydney, who wrote an article on the March of the Living, which was entitled "Here There Is No Why, So Why Do We Come Here?" And it's that similar question of what propels people to go, and to what do we gain from this, or what do we lose in some ways as well. Megan, do you want to come back on those points that have raised? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think so the idea of this embodied remembrance is very common across a variety of platforms. You see this a lot on Instagram in particular. People feeling the need to, follow the path that so many took to their death. And I think students said that in the documentary itself, this idea that being there and physically being in the space and the landscape where it happened will unlock something or awaken something, or like Udi said, like it'll make things more clear, or it'll help them try to understand something which is largely understandable in many ways. And I've seen some arguments, kind of to circle back to Jackie's point about the selfie and placing the self front and center rather than the experience in the space. Some people have made the argument that taking a selfie places the body of a living person experientially in this space. I don't know if I necessarily buy that, because the self is so up front and it's center that I find it kind of blocks out anything that's in the back. And, you're not necessarily focused on what the space means or what the visit means. Like Jackie said, you're focused on, like, how should I smile? How many dislikes will I get on Twitter if I don't smile appropriately? Should I smile at all? Should I look sad? And that performative embodied aspect I found very interesting. You see it kind of right off the bat in the documentary with the young girl who found, I think it was her great-great-grandfather's grave in the graveyard, and she's posing with the headstone in a particular way, looking sad. And then as soon as the photo is finished being taken, she like snaps out of it. And it's all kind of still tied up in this experiential idea that if you go and you embody, these activities and you participate in this space, that it'll unlock something, an answer. And I found it also very interesting, the scene where the teens are sitting on the train tracks and they're saying, okay, we're going to experience the cold. We're going to take off our layers to kind of see how people felt. And then they also then get told off by, I think, another visitor to the space, which is a really kind of interesting interaction because, I mean, there is an element of like kind of policing behavior. I mean, are they being respectful? What are they doing? Are they joking around? And it was so interesting to see that kind of clash of embodiment and behavior in that space. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack, especially when the tour guides have them like lining up next to a bunk to say, this is how many people would sleep in a bunk, or this is how many of you we can fit in a train car, or et cetera, et cetera. And I think it, on a pedagogical level, I don't know how useful that kind of embodiment is for teens. It might be a lot. It's very interesting to me, though, that it seems to hinge on this element that they feel that they have to go to understand it. As the young man said, in the trailer, I have to see it, and then I'll understand it.
Brilliant, thank you. So there's quite a few questions coming through on the chat, so I mean, we will just turn to it in a minute. A lot of the conversation so far has been around the kind of the academic questions around what's being shown, what's being said, but I'm also curious to think about this from a filmmaking perspective as well. And at the beginning, Jackie mentioned the different versions, and Udi replied to that before everyone got here. And as part of that, we discussed the drone at the beginning, and I was quite struck by that and by the sound, because I watched it with headphones and the sound of the rotors was really quite overbearing. And so I tried to find it on YouTube, and the version I found on YouTube had this kind of schmaltzy romantic tune to it, and had an advert for GoPro at the beginning and the end. And I'm just really interested in how the process of putting these things together happens.
Yeah, it's I see Uri smiling here, who was the wonderful composer of the music in the film. It was a weird process, which none of us, I think, we couldn't really envision when we started it how it will play out, because we've never made a film using so many diverse sources, which are also, most of them are already heavily edited. They have their own sort of, it's a million different formats. The places change. There's forgot the number by now, but I think over 150 sources in the film. So it's a lot of, and we're actually releasing another YouTube documentary in a month at Hot Docs, if someone's interested in that kind of filmmaking method. But I think the basic of what we did was, I would say, comparative editing. We basically took a bunch of footage, a bunch of videos from YouTube that we thought had an interesting moment in them. It could be an interesting person, an interesting guide or student, a bizarre or weird situation, and a fascinating image of some sort, anything that drew our attention out of these thousands that are available online. Then we downloaded all of these, and then we started sort of overlaying them and cutting them according to certain similarities. So these all take place in Majdanek. These all are moments where people are talking about feeling something. These all are, it was grouping things by topic or location or atmosphere, and even sometimes by color. The first scene in the film was composed by sort of realizing at a certain point that would be a green scene. It's just a scene that takes place in green places. So it could be all sorts of links that helped us to start compose something out of this endless variety. And there were certain differences between versions, for sure. The film had quite a lot of versions eventually. I think we had 4 in total. The first one went on air on Israeli television, and not just Israeli television, it went on air on like the most, I don't know, mainstream, click, 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 really quick, and, you know, just make it so the viewer never zaps away kind of Israeli television, which is the furthest thing you can imagine from an experimental documentary like this with YouTube and diverse sources and so on. But they were brave enough to take it on, and we also had to adjust to their needs. So the first version was 45 minutes long. It was way quicker. It didn't have 4 minutes of noisy drone shot at the beginning, because that's impossible on television. So it was a very different style in how it was sort of wrapped. And then we went on to create the version that you saw now. It was the second version, and that was really oriented to festivals more than anything else. So that was oriented back in the days when there were still cinemas and people were sitting in cinema theaters. That is the experience that we were aiming for. So for that, for example, we knew that we have a captured audience. Nobody would probably leave the room in the 4 first minutes of the screening, so you can be really harsh and start it like that. And if I need to attest to why we did that, more than anything, I think it was, so we found this drone shot, which we thought was an interesting way. You know, you could see the person. It's not a professional drone shot, so you see it's not like a professionally made, beautiful, seamless drone shot. You could see the person operating it, which for us was the thing about this shot. And we knew that the film had so much sort of noise and jumping from thing to thing, and we wanted to tell the viewer right in the last second, you know, you're gonna watch something now that is shaky even. The experience, I have to say, for us, the experience of first watching this documentary on a big screen was super, super weird and almost troubling, because sometimes it even gives you a headache. You know, that you're not used to seeing on a big screen something moving so much, you know, so many like user-generated materials from cameras that are totally pixelated. And maybe today, I think after this year with Zoom, everybody's more used to that already. But back then it was really a physical experience. So I think we wanted to start with something noisy and strange and shaky. That was the reason for opening with that strange shot. But there was much discussion about that back then already.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Yuri.
Just to add to one short sentence about this, I think when you watch the movie, you think a lot about manipulation, right? The manipulation that the students go through because of the teachers or the organization, and the manipulations of YouTube or social media. But I think it's worth remembering that a movie is also manipulation, and the making of this movie had a lot of manipulations, and in a way that was also my role as a composer, was to manipulate the audience. And I think one of the interesting things is not only to think that there is manipulation, but also ask what sort of manipulation and what for, like what are the reasons for the manipulations. And I think for me, that's the biggest difference between the different versions, is what sort of story about manipulations they say, because they speak to different audiences in different formats. And like they're all very similar in many ways, but they point a different projector at something that has to do with manipulation. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, brilliant. So is there questions from the floor? Can I ask? I mean, we have some in the chat, but would anybody like to join with a microphone and ask a question, or should I turn to the chat? You want to raise a hand or just simply speak?
I'm happy to start if I'm allowed to.
Go initially, yeah, go for it.
I was just wondering about, so when I was in sixth form, I had the choice to go on a UK trip to Poland run by Tribe. And I knew that it was going to be very much the Hatikva singing, Israeli flag wearing, pressure to cry, very emotional 7 days. And I decided I didn't want to do that. I ended up going on the Holocaust Educational Trust Day to Auschwitz trip. Sorry, the cat. Because I decided that I wanted to just experience, just kind of go see Auschwitz-Birkenau and then process it in my own time. But I wondered whether anyone could comment on if there's something unique about the Israeli trips in comparison to the British or American ones, if there's something about maybe a specific Israeli kind of national agenda of this needs to be a collective thing that we work towards, that isn't the same in the diaspora communities.
I think that there's someone actually Oren Steer in the audience actually will probably have something more to say about that too, because he actually wrote on many years ago on the diaspora trips. Something about the diaspora trips often puzzled me, and that is, in the travel agency, there was, when people used travel agents, what's known as known as an open jaw ticket, which is you go from place A to place B and there to place C, and that's your ticket, and you don't come back to place A. And it struck me that many of these diaspora Jewish trips are, if you like, open jaw Holocaust trips. They go, some of them, the classic March of the Living, right, which is probably where you bring thousands of people to march together from Auschwitz to Birkenau on Holocaust Memorial Day, right, in a procession with Israelis leading and everyone else in alphabetical order, is one that very much, at least ceremonially, reinforces an Israeli narrative, right? I live in Los Angeles, so Auschwitz, Poland is the past, Israel is the future. Great, and now we go back to Los Angeles. Yeah, it often doesn't give really a cosmological place to that diaspora in that story, which is not to say that people who participate, and maybe even guides, don't improvise or provide their own, and saying, don't intermarry or live a Jewish life, in Montreal or wherever, and then you become a kind of redemptive answer as well. But the ritual text is usually a very Israeli one, and a kind of a Zionist one. And Jack Kugelmass wrote that, very documented of people coming from Montreal and starting out with a Canadian flag and then winding up the march with an Israeli one. So these kind of, symbolic structures, create a kind of a separation. Where I found it interesting, so one student wrote a paper on a Reform Jewish trip to Czech Republic and Poland. And one of the things that he wrote is that they had absolutely no conception that the people around them, the non-Jews who they encountered, were anti-Semitic, which is the text of the Israeli trips. Even when at Poland, one place when they mocked them, they said, probably they're not used to seeing tourists and they don't like Americans. It wasn't even anti-Semitism. And his suggestion was that the reason was that they had an hour and a half of free time at lunchtime and they would all meet up and share music at McDonald's. So the fact that there was this informal break was not part of the program, and they could actually say, oh, these kids, they eat cheeseburgers too, and they, what music do they listen to? Kind of broke this sort of the kind of the seal of the bubble that encloses Israeli trips and divides it into death world and life world, right? The other thing that I think is very significant is that many of the trips that are done not in large delegations, but as families, have a different text. Carol Kidron has written about this as ways of trying to come to terms with the past, of creating catharsis among the families, creating a relation with across generations, which can happen on the delegation trips, but is central on family trips. And yeah, and then you have others like the Hasidic trips to Poland, where they can spend, a week going from one sacred, one holy tomb to another and not even go to Auschwitz, saying, what's there to learn there? There's nothing there, we are there, the past is in Poland and we're its continuation. So, Auschwitz, we didn't do Auschwitz. That's the Goyim. That's not us. So there it's entirely different, and yes, they feel that emptiness, of course, and the Holocaust is there, but it's not, in this sense, it plays a different role somehow in their identity, at least on the trips.
That's lovely. Thank you, Jackie.
Wearing Israeli flags when you do it.
So in a sense, that brings another questions in the chat. Adam and Rosalind we've got, and Neil as well also wants to ask a question. Thank you, Imogen, as well. So, but before I do that, Oren, do you want to respond, given that Jackie referred to you in his answer?
It's really nice of you. I don't want to take a lot of time. I really appreciate it. And this is just an unbelievable thing that Zoom has given us for all the things that we haven't gotten the last year. To see Jackie again and Megan again with this medium is really remarkable. So thank you. I think Jackie described it as an open jaw ticket, and I would go further and I would say it's really like a triangulation, because that identity, that diaspora identity, ends up being reinforced upon the return, but there's sort of a series of questions, right? It's not the death world of Europe of the past, and it's not the life world of Israel of the present either. For Americans, it's not choosing between the binary. It's trying to figure out what is their place. And I imagine for those from the UK as well, what is their place kind of within that schema? And I think what happens is that it devolves back on the reinforcement of identity. So if there's nothing else, if you can't be, obviously nobody can kind of be, well, not no one, but the idea of being Jewish and Polish is not really a message that's at all conveyed, right? And if you're coming from the diaspora, so you can't be really Jewish and Israeli unless you want to make Aliyah. So the only option left is to be Jewish and wherever you're from, right? American, UK, whatever. And so you come back to that space and you triangulate that identity, and then you try to figure out what your responsibility is to that past, not really being able to fully embody it. So what I'm so fascinated by in this conversation is coming back to that issue of embodiment, right? So Israelis go and they come back, they embody it completely. I mean, they only go for a week and they come back, and somebody posted in the chat already, and then they go into the army, like it's seamless. Like, this is why they're in the army. This is why Israel exists. It's just, there's a very, very clear kind of binary logic, as Jackie has shown. What happens to Americans? Well, that's not the option for them. So instead, they have to figure out, what is my responsibility to my Jewish identity? Oh, I guess I have to marry Jewish. I guess I have to give to Federation. I guess I have to kind of do all these kind of civil religious acts or more in order to myself embody that legacy that otherwise I don't have access to unless I want to go, make Aliyah or something. But I'm not on the panel, and I really want to hear more from folks who are on it. Thank you.
It's a question and answer, so it's fine, Aaron. Thank you very much for adding. You also mentioned the point that Adam raised, and Adam's next, so that might also be a good segue into Adam, who's muted.
I think Rosalind may have been before me, but anyway, I guess. Thank you. I mean, I really found myself, I thought it was a wonderful film, and it really helped me kind of confirm my understanding both of kind of Israel but I have actually to say I found it incredibly upsetting. First of all, that so many people are marching around the place where many members of my family were murdered, kind of, and waving national flags, but also kind of getting to the point where they are working themselves up, particularly the scenes with the children you know, the murdered children and stuff. And it's clearly instrumental. I mean, somebody said, we can't, Jackie, we can't, you said at the beginning, we can't tell how successful these things are. But maybe if we think about kind of the number, you know, what happens to those people who join the army, or what the, you know, the kind of ruthlessness which now seems to be accepted in increasingly in large sections of Israeli society. I think one can say, sadly, it's been successful. It seems to me absolutely in the tradition of the Israeli army flying over Auschwitz in 2003. You know, the F-15s all piloted by Holocaust survivors' children, you know, and it's very much part of that militarization. Something it really reminded me of was actually a trip in Serbia to being taken when I was on a kind of film school visit to Serbia and was taken to Kosovo as a kind of absolutely, it was crucial to show us this foundation myth, do you know what I mean? And hopefully to understand why they were so exercised about it, obviously. And it seems to me that it's an incredibly moving film. I also really liked the tenderness with which you treated, or the teenagers responded. But I have to say that it also seemed to me a kind of to indicate something, a brutality which is kind of increasingly present, as far as I can see, in Israeli society, and something that kind of, I thank you for making a film which makes that so plain.
Thank you, Adam. I suspect with all the questions, there's going to be 1,000 answers and 1,000 segues or consequences, but so can we just go to Rosalind and then to Neil and then to Caroline? So Rosalind, and apologies if I missed you earlier.
No, that's fine. I'd like to make a comment first of all. I'm a photographer, and this business with selfies I have witnessed all over the world, in remote places, in Ethiopia and the Iguazu waterfalls in Brazil and Argentina, where people are completely disconnected from where they are. They don't see the beauty of the nature. They see themselves in the nature. And we're not talking about young people. I've seen it with people in their 70s and 80s doing exactly the same. They walk up to this spectacular viewpoint in the Iguazu waterfalls. They turn around, they take a photograph. Do they turn back? No, they walk away. I spent 4 whole days of about 10 hours per day just absorbing this amazing natural wonder. And they were there, and then they went. So that was my first comment, because this is, I know about the Holocaust, but I don't think it's very different about disconnecting your feelings about where you are. The question I wanted to ask Udi and Jackie is, what does Israeli culture gain from its emphasis to its youth on the horrors of the Holocaust, and yet denies in its education system the stories of the Yemenite Jews, the Soviet Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, all of whom have trials and all of whom are survivors in their own right of quite shocking things which have happened in their countries? Why are the youth not taken to the Amhara region of Ethiopia or the Gulag in what was the USSR? I know you don't have an answer, but based on what you've been showing us, why do you think this is? I've spent a lot of time in Ethiopia, and this has always troubled me, that if they really wanted the Israeli society to be, to come together and for there not to be racism, this would be a great thing for them to do.
Udi or Jackie, I don't mind.
I mean, your original question, I think, was what does Israeli society gain from that? I believe nothing. But I think the Holocaust is a pivotal part of the Israeli narrative. It has been since the beginning, and certainly since the 60s. And I think it's a very today, it serves as a very effective instrument of indoctrination. I mean, again, I spoke about the Holocaust before. There are good reasons to deal with it. or at least I was personally sort of obsessed with it for years. I think it's a fascinating thing to look at, and you can learn a lot from it. And there are super important questions to draw from it. But I also think that in the way that it's structured in Israeli education and in the Israeli psyche, in a way, in the Israeli public life, the way it's treated every year in the ceremonies, the way prime ministers, or rather prime minister, speaks about it, it's a very effective instrument in sort of finding justifications for the absurd realities that we live in.
But this is an Ashkenazi question. The other countries, as I've mentioned, no, not the USSR, but Ethiopia, Yemenite, does not fit into this Ashkenazi concept. And because the country has been up to recently so dominated by an Ashkenazi mindset and agenda, do you not think that is why the Holocaust is chosen in this way?
I'm sure it plays a part in it, as it did in everything in the first years of this place and until today. But I do think it's a very effective. The reason it's still in the center is, I believe, because it's a very effective tool of justification for what's going on here, way more than other things. But yeah, I'm interested in what Jackie has to say.
I think that, I mean, part of it certainly is part of the story. Yes, it's a question of power, and if there were more Ethiopian leaders in positions of power, we might see trips to Amhara, to the areas. At one point, they even tried to start to initiate, trips of Sfadim to Spain. But one thing is, you need to, the landscape has to work right. The trips from the beginning, for example, were to Poland and not to Germany, because, well, Germany looks wrong. Go tell, go explain about, about the final solution when there's so much cool stuff out there in Berlin. It's become a problem even, you need, look, I worked I made my living 20 years as a tour guide for Christian pilgrims, okay? If it doesn't look right, yeah, you're right, so if it doesn't look right, it won't work. Certainly, and in part of the looking right, one can point to crumbling Soviet 1950s buildings and talk about the Holocaust because it looks the right shades of black, white, and gray and cracks, and people can imagine that it happened here, even if that building was, even if the whole ghetto was destroyed and the building was put up later. But in Berlin, it's hard, and as Oren commented, and I've seen as well, and in a place like Warsaw, it's becoming harder and harder over time, also because there's plenty of cool stuff in Warsaw that doesn't look like people expect the Holocaust to look like. So, what are you going to, you need the power in Ethiopia, for example, in order to see that requires a tremendous amount of imagination, because there isn't the building all the structures that you have, like you have in, in Auschwitz or in Majdanek. The other thing is, I would hope that's not the case, because yes, it could be done, where other groups receive power and then claim their victimization. But I would hope that one could build an identity that doesn't place that victimization at center, and that doesn't, for example, cast the history, for example, of Jews in North Africa or in Ethiopia, for that matter, in the shape of a kind of, Zionist narrative of what European life was like, where it was all, pogroms and suffering until the final big one came for all those who didn't make it to Israel before. But rather, to see a more complex reality, which is, well, I was going to say, which is possible to show in Poland, but it's getting harder again with the current Polish government. But still, a trip to Poland doesn't have to be going from death camp to death camp. There are other ways, and maybe sometimes more productive ways, of also getting in touch not only with questions of the Holocaust and responsibility, but also with issues of Jewish life in Poland, and the focus solely on the victim elides all kinds of very important moral questions, because the victim almost by definition is innocent and almost inevitably has a very limited moral choices that were open to him.
Thank
now,
you.
To have to meet the
Can I
bystander is something else. But yeah,
that's all right.
Thanks for that.
That's okay. Claire, is it okay to take 5 minutes extra because we started 5 minutes late? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Is that all right?
yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
brilliant. Thank you. So Neil, you're next.
Yes, no, thank you. I mean, first of all, thank you, Udi and Uri, for a really fascinating film, I found, and I've enjoyed the discussion too greatly. And most of my thoughts about this, I think, are still kind of swimming around and forming, and I'm sort of correspondingly loath to try to articulate them. But I would like to come back a little bit to the sort of not so hidden curatorial hand of the filmmaker and the composer, and the sort of subjectivities that are kind of in operation there. And partly, I guess, because I'm a historian of Germany rather than Israel, ask you about that fascinating scene where all of a sudden the Gentile German woman kind of rocks up and starts distributing, sort of yellow love hearts in a manner that just feels desperately awkward, and one can kind of feel some of the students kind of very bemused, and some accepting the gesture of friendship, and someone kind of senses a bristling slightly. And be that as it may, it felt like a very conscious choice on your part to sort of rupture the story of the Jewish journey with this sort of sole presence of the Gentile woman. So I'm kind of curious to know what work you think that scene does in the film, and why you chose it at the time, and perhaps how it looks to you, if you look at the film again later.
Interesting question. I'll tell you, I'll start from the end, from what kind of reaction this scene generates. Because when this film was screened in Israel, it was screened in Israel on TV before, then in Germany, then back in Israel. But when it was screened in Israel, and granted, the Israeli audience tends to be quite lively in all manners and contexts, but it was, at least in the first screenings that we had at Tel Aviv, it was almost like a comedy. I mean, it was waves of laughter throughout the screening, and we were sitting there, the people who worked on the film, we were sitting there sort of not knowing even how to react to that. Of course, we saw a lot of moments in the film as funny when we worked on it, but it's still sort of a heavy topic, and we didn't address the whole issue as a comedy, but the result for certain kinds of Israeli audiences, at least, were an absolute comedy. And again, very lively, a lot of reactions. Then the screening in Germany, again, might be typical, I guess, but it was complete silence from the first moment, no reaction to anything, there's, and I think whenever a German audience, watches a film about this specific topic, it tends to be quite tense, especially when there's an Israeli filmmaker in the room. But it was very silent. You could cut the tension with a knife, up to the moment where this lady comes on with the stickers. Then it was a huge wave of reactions. Some people were grasping in shock. Some people were laughing. It kept rolling and rolling and rolling for a minute or two. I think that is basically the reason this scene was in. And I think it was in a way for both audiences. I think that for the Israeli audience, it was in a way important for us to show that when there's a lot of criticism about how Israelis deal with the Holocaust in the film, at least in the way we view it. And it was important for us to show that it's also very human to deal with this weird and unthinkable subject in a weird and strange way. And it wasn't just a Jewish thing or an Israeli thing of sort of obsessing about it or relating to it in strange ways. everybody relates to it, or a lot of peoples will relate to it in strange ways, because it is a strange event that is hard for most of us to accumulate. So I think that was for the Israelis. And for the German audience, and these were the two main audiences that the film was oriented for. It was broadcasted on Israeli television, German television, and in cinemas in Israel and Germany. For the rest, it screened here and there, but this is the audience. And I think that for the German audience, we couldn't even anticipate this reaction that I told you about, but it's in a way the reason that it was there. We wanted to show that, yes, the way Israelis relate to this topic are very strange, but it's strange all over. So I think that's the reason that it was there, basically. Plus, I mean, there's, you know, in filmmaking, in editing, there is the simple question of in and out. And when a moment is what we call in, it's just in. When the scene is strong enough, strange enough, again, caught our attention in a strong enough way, it will make it into the film by all accounts. Yeah, and one of the interesting things is that this is Sagi, my partner. The interesting thing is that when we spoke to her, I forgot her name by now. I'm sorry, it's 4 years ago. But when we spoke to her, she was of course very thrilled with the moment itself. She, you know, with it being on YouTube and so on. But she was also happy for it to be in the film, and she was also happy to see it in the context of the film. So for her, it was a lovely moment through and through. And it's important to say that with the Israeli audience as well, I would say, I didn't make a formal research about it, but it's more or less half and half. Half the people, half the audiences, or half the audience, sometimes in the same hall, in the same theater, who saw this film, saw a very critical, very disturbing, very dark sort of voice that comes out of it, or conclusion. And the other half saw it as a documentation of a beautiful and very moving educational journey, as an educational process. So it really depends on who saw it.
Brilliant answer, Udi. Thank you. Caroline, we're slightly over, but would you still like to have your question? It seems only fair as you've waited.
Okay, sorry, just really a quick comment. There's several of us, I can see Graham and Alistair, we're educators on lessons from Auschwitz that Anushka mentioned. I mean, I've been doing it since 2006. So a very British, different experience of one day, majority of students are not Jewish. So it does cause a lot of discussions. We have follow-ups and sessions before and after of sort of behaviour and the very British non-flag waving sort of way of visiting, and then to see for our students. But so I've just been interested, are you ever thinking of looking at how other countries respond and make films on that? Because I think that would be fascinating. I don't know how much British, American, German, Polish students upload films. I think, and if there's any way we can use some of your film or clips for our students would be amazing. But I'd be interested to see the differences if you've been looking at that. Is that in the pipeline? Sorry, quick question.
I will refer you. I don't think for us personally, at least, we have stopped dealing with the subject of the Holocaust for a while in our private lives. I think we just needed that space. But but I salute you, who, you know, some of you who are studying this for years. It's a hard topic to be submerged in. But what I will refer you to is a website called. It's not something that we personally, Sagi and I, sort of directed or did, but we were part of it. It was mainly produced by the German production company that co-produced this project with us. I refer you to a website, www.uploading-holocaust.com. That is an educational tool that was developed in conjunction with a bunch of organizations that deal with Holocaust remembrance in Germany and with the German producers, based on the footage from the film. That aims, it's over by now, but it was a bit like an interactive survey, and it was aimed at sort of feeling the crowd in a way amongst German youngsters, and how they would like to deal with Holocaust remembrance. There were some interesting conclusions. There were a couple of studies that came out as a result of that online project. So you can check it out on the website of the interactive project.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. So we've come to the end of our time. So thank all our panelists very much. I'm very much aware that the discussion at the end was largely on the questions of Israel and the filmmaking itself. So Udi and Jackie have spoken. Megan, is there anything you'd like to add or to conclude with, just as some closing thoughts? It seems only fair to ask you.
I think, so I apologize for the internet blip that happened there as well. It's probably windy in Ottawa, God knows. Anyway, I wanted to touch a little bit more on, even just to conclude, this idea that how individuals, how students are expected to experience Holocaust memory tends to hinge back on this idea of what the Holocaust looks like visually, or what we expect it to look like. As my internet cut out, we were in the middle of this great conversation about how, students rely on these visual signposts to understand visually what they're coming up against and what they're grappling with. And I still find it so fascinating that right at the beginning of the film, we have just a clip from that young man saying, "Oh, Poland is really green. I didn't expect it to be so green." And I think it's interesting that while the film deals mostly with, this pressure to feel and all of these different interactions that these students are having with these spaces, it's still very much caught up in what they are taught that the Holocaust is supposed to look like. And that visual element is still very much important in how we perceive it contemporarily, even though, more time is passing every day. So I just wonder in the future, as even I think Oren said in the chat that even Poland is looking more and more wrong as Warsaw, gets cooler and cooler. I wonder how that visual element is going to impact how we teach and perceive the Holocaust in the future. So, and thank you for having me. This was a lovely discussion.
Thank you very much. Claire, do you want to plug the next event before we depart?
Yeah, I wanted to say also thank you to Anushka, Alexander Rose, and Uri Agnon, who have organized and curated this event. So thank you, and thank you to you, James, also for chairing. Next week we have the Parks lecture, our annual Parks lecture, and I've put the link if you want to register, and you can also sign up to our mailing list. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Good night, everyone.